How did a 30-ton steel killing machine, designed to tear through the German panzer divisions, learn to swim? And more importantly, what happened when the water was deeper than the metal it was made of? By the autumn of 1943, the Red Army had spent 2 brutal years, pushing the Wehrmacht back across the rivers of Ukraine and Belarus. But rivers were the great equalizers. The Dnieper, the Desna, the Pripyat, these were natural barriers hundreds of meters wide, lined with German machine gun nests and artillery. The Soviets had bridging units, but they were slow, vulnerable, and prime targets for the Luftwaffe. The Red Army needed a way to get armor across a river fast, without waiting for a bridge. And so, on the banks of the Dnieper that October, a desperate experiment began. Soldiers of the 3rd Guards Tank Army, using little more than scrap metal and welding torches, attempted to make the T-34 swim. The T-34-76 was the workhorse of the Soviet war machine. By 1943, it was being churned out in factories in Nizhny Tagil and Chelyabinsk at a rate that stunned German intelligence. But the T-34 had one massive flaw. It was a submarine only in the sense that if you put it in deep water, it would sink like an anvil. It had no native amphibious capability. The pre-war Soviet doctrine had experimented with light, flimsy amphibious tanks like the T-37 and T-38, but these were reconnaissance vehicles with paper-thin 9mm armor, easily punctured by a rifle round. They were death traps, and by 1941 most had been destroyed. But necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. In October 1943, the Red Army was conducting a massive offensive to liberate Kiev. The Dnieper River lay directly in their path. German engineers had destroyed every bridge, and the West Bank was a wall of fortified bluffs. The Soviet command decided on a bold, costly strategy. Seize multiple small bridgeheads on the Western Bank using infantry, then rush heavy equipment across before the Germans could counterattack. The problem was, how do you get a 26-ton T-34 across a river that is 800 meters wide without a bridge? Engineer Captain Mikhail Ivanovich Koshkin of the 12th Guards Tank Brigade proposed a radical solution. He had seen soldiers using logs to float trucks across smaller streams. If they could create enough displacement, they could keep the tank on the surface just long enough to cross. He ordered his men to scavenge the battlefield. They collected empty steel fuel drums, broken wooden beams, and sheets of scrap metal. The idea was to build a makeshift pontoon, a skirt, around the hull of the T-34. The work was done at night, under the cover of birch forests on the eastern bank, to avoid German spotter planes. The concept was crude but logical. They would weld steel brackets to the sides of the T-34's hull. Onto these brackets, they would lash thick logs and empty sealed fuel drums. The theory was that the drums would provide enough buoyancy to keep the 26-ton tank from sinking immediately. To make it watertight, they stuffed oakum, tarred, rope fibers into the gaps between the hull and the improvised floats, then covered the entire assembly with tarpaulin pulled tight and nailed to wooden planks. By the morning of October 5, 1943, 3 T-34s from the 1st Battalion had been modified. They looked like floating sheds. The crew of the lead tank, commanded by Junior Lieutenant Alexei Petrov, were skeptical. Sergeant Mikhail Rodionov, the driver, reportedly kicked one of the drums and muttered, "If this keeps us afloat, I will swim the Volga myself." The plan was simple. They would cross at dawn, using the morning mist as cover. The target was a small bridgehead near the village of Veliki Bukrin, a bend in the river that had already cost thousands of infantry lives. The Germans on the high cliffs knew the Soviets would try to ferry armor across. They had 88mm anti-aircraft guns zeroed in on the water, waiting for the slow-moving barges. But they weren't expecting a tank to simply drive off the bank and start swimming. At 600 hours, Petrov's T-34 rolled down the muddy bank and into the black water of the Dnieper. For a moment, it worked. The logs and drums held. The tank bobbed, bow high, as the tracks churned uselessly in the water. The tank relied entirely on the current and the momentum of its initial plunge to move forward. They were 200 meters out, halfway across the main channel. The mist was thinning. Suddenly, a German machine gun team on the high bank spotted the strange shape and opened fire. The bullets pinged off the turret, but then tracer rounds ignited the tarpaulin covering the starboard side floats. The fire began to consume the oakum seal. Water started seeping into the engine compartment. Rodionov gunned the engine, trying to drive forward through the water, but the drag was too much. The tank began to list heavily to the right. The makeshift skirt was failing. Petrov knew they had two choices: sink in the middle of the Dnieper or drive for the bottom. He shouted at Rodionov, "Full throttle! Drive the bottom!" It was a desperate gamble. The Dnieper at that point was over. 15 meters deep, far, deeper than any fording depth. But Rodionov understood. He slammed the T-34 into a low gear and gave it full power. The engine screamed. The tracks, designed to grip mud and snow, found no purchase in the water. For a terrifying 30 seconds, the tank continued to sink, water now lapping at the base of the turret. Pause. Then they felt it, a lurch, a grinding of metal on earth. The tank had hit an underwater sandbar, a submerged ridge that ran diagonally across the river. It wasn't solid ground, but it was enough. The tracks bit into the sand, and the T-34 literally walked along the bottom of the Dnieper, with water up to the driver's hatch, lurching forward in a cloud of silt. The Germans on the cliff stopped shooting, stunned to see what looked like a sinking. Tank suddenly stabilize and continue, moving sideways through the river. As the water shallowed near the western bank, the tank burst from the surface, water cascading off the hull, the burning floats reduced to smoking wreckage. The T-34, now fully exposed, clanked up the muddy bank. The German machine gunners, who had been watching the spectacle, were less than 50 meters away. They had no anti-tank weapon ready. They never expected a tank to emerge from the river itself. Petrov's gunner traversed the F-34, checked trajectory gun, and fired a high explosive, round directly into the machine gun nest. That single T-34, covered in mud and the charred remains of its swimming skirt, spent the next 4 hours raising havoc on the German second line of defense. It destroyed 3 Piak-40 anti-tank guns and 2 armored half-tracks before finally being knocked out by a Panzer IV from the 19th Panzer Division late in the afternoon. But its job was done. The confusion it caused allowed sappers from the 3rd, guards to finish constructing a ferry landing, and by nightfall, 4 more tanks had crossed. Of the 3 tanks that attempted the swim that morning, one sank in the deep channel, its crew drowning trapped inside. Another made it across, but its engine seized from water ingestion as soon as it hit the bank. But Petrov's tank proved that with enough desperation and ingenuity, a 30-ton tank could cross a river without a bridge. Pause. The Red Army never officially adopted these improvised skirts. They were too dangerous, too makeshift. But the lessons learned on the Dnieper directly influenced the design of the post-war PT-76, a tank designed from the ground up to swim, using water jets instead of tracks to propel itself through the water. Petrov was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Banner. His gamble bought a bridgehead a few more hours of life, a few more hours that, in the grand arithmetic of war, added up to the liberation of Kiev 2 months later. The image of a T-34, half submerged and wreathed in smoke, clawing its way from the depths of the Dnieper, is a testament to the wild ingenuity forced upon soldiers by war. It was a desperate act, born of necessity, and it came at a terrible cost. But it worked.